Okay, good afternoon. So today we are going to start a new system, which is the endocrine system. And in fact, this system is closely related to the nervous system that we have just finished studying. And probably that was mentioned earlier, that these two systems are so closely related to each other, they work together. That's why we are having them in one block. So you can see that both systems here, they use mediator molecules. The mediator molecules are in the nervous system. They are neurotransmitters, such as the acetylcholine, the noradrenaline, and they are released locally and usually in response to electrical impulses, to nerve impulses. If you compare that with the endocrine system, you will find that the mediator molecules, they are called hormones, and they are delivered to tissues through the blood. So they are not released locally, and there are different types of hormones, as you will see in a moment. The site of action of the mediator molecule, it will be very close to the site of its release in the nervous system. Either it is in the postsynaptic membrane, or if there is a muscle, it will be at the motor end plate of the muscle. There's only a very small gap in between the nerve terminal or synaptic end button and the effector organ. But in case of the endocrine system, it is far from the site of release, because the hormone is going to be circulated in the blood and has far-reaching effects and bind to receptors and target cells. These cells, they could be of different types of cells. Not necessarily like the target cells of the nervous system in number 3. The target cells are either muscles or glands or other neurons. But in any cell in the body can be affected by the hormones. So it could be bone, it could be cartilage, it could be muscle tissue, it could be again fat cell, liver cell, any cell in the body will be affected by the hormone. And the time of onset, the time of onset of the action in the nervous system is immediate. In fact, it's within milliseconds, and it doesn't take a very long time, the duration, but it is longer in the endocrine system and longer duration time. Probably we mentioned previously, I just give you an example of the sympathetic reaction. We mentioned that last time. We said that the sympathetic reaction takes long time. It stays for a long time. The reason for that is that part of the reaction is due to nerve stimulation, and part of the reaction is due to the release of noradrenaline as a hormone from not as a neurotransmitter, but as a hormone from the adrenal medulla, and this will be lingering for a long time because it circulates in the blood. The endocrine system has structures or glands that are exclusively endocrine glands. They don't have any other function. We're going to study them in details. The pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal, and the pineal gland. But there are other organs and tissues that have other functions as well as the endocrine function. As an example, we are going to start with the hypothalamus, for example. The hypothalamus, we have already studied the hypothalamus as part of the central nervous system. It is the part of the diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But we will see in a moment that there are some nuclei, which are collection of nerve cell bodies inside the central nervous system. These nuclei, they secrete neurohormones, they secrete hormones. So it's not only restricted in neuronal circuits, but it also secretes hormones. The same thing is, for example, the thymus. I'm not going to go into all details, but just mention like the first 3 examples. The thymus. The thymus is part of the immune system of the body, lymphatic system of the body, and at the same time it produces hormones that are necessary for the maturation of certain types of lymphocytes. We're going to study them in block 3, which are called T lymphocytes. T referring to the thymus, to the T of the thymus. And then the pancreas, which we already have mentioned that probably twice until now, and we are going to stress this today as well, that the pancreas is a combination of exocrine and endocrine part. The endocrine part is the gland, which are the islets of the Langerhans, and the exocrine part of the pancreas is most of the pancreas, which secretes digestive enzymes. So this is a slide has been copied from the first block, that in the body we have essentially two types of glands. We have exocrine glands, which secrete their secretion through ducts, and therefore it will affect locally, like for example the sweat glands or the sebaceous glands. They have local effects and they need ducts. Or the ductless glands, the endocrine glands, that secrete their secretion as hormones into the blood, and so they have far-reaching effects. They don't have ducts and they have far-reaching effects. And some of the glands are mixed glands, like the example of the pancreas that I have just mentioned. The exocrine part of the pancreas has a pancreatic duct. We're going to study the details of the duct when we come to the gastrointestinal system in block 3, and you will find that the duct opens into the duodenum and it secretes pancreatic juices that are needed for digestion of food and absorption. So the hormones are the mediators that are produced by the endocrine glands, and they are molecules that affect the activity of other cells. Suppose that these cells, they have specific receptors in their wall for that hormone. And by receptors, I'm referring again to the first or second lecture that we had in block 1. Remember that these are protein molecules that act as receptors for ligands. These receptors are manufactured, they are produced by the cytoplasm, and then they are pushed to the cell membrane. So that's why the number of the receptors might vary. It is not fixed, and it is continuously replaced. And the number, as I said, it varies, and this is what we call either upregulation or downregulation, depending on the amount of the circulating hormone. So if we have like a small amount of circulating hormone, then the cells that are affected by that hormone will produce more receptors, so that to increase the sensitivity of the cell for the small amount of hormone. When the hormone is secreted in excess for one reason or another, then the cells will reduce the amount of these receptors. It will destroy the receptors and by endocytosis degrades them, and so there are less receptors on the cell membrane, and so this will reduce the sensitivity of the cell to the hormone. We will start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, as I said, it is not a unique gland. It is not a unique endocrine organ. It is a nerve. It's part of the central nervous system, and partly it is a gland. So we will start with it. It is the major, maestro of that controls the pituitary gland, which is the major endocrine gland in the body. See here, the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a stalk, which is called the infundibulum. The term infundibulum means like a funnel, so it looks like a funnel, wide above, and then it narrows down until it reaches the pituitary glands. We know that the hypothalamus has a lot of connections in the nervous system and has a lot of functions. This is not the only function of the hypothalamus to produce these hormones. Below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. This is the shape of the pituitary gland. It is divided into two parts, an anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary, and this is the infundibulum, or the stalk that connects it to the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland, if you remember from block 1, it is located in the pituitary fossa here, the hypophyseal fossa. What is the other name of the pituitary fossa? It's the sella turcica. Yeah, it is like the Turkish saddle. Okay, so because it looks like a saddle, so they call it the sella turcica, and it is part of the sphenoid bone. You can see the close proximity of the pituitary gland to the sphenoidal air sinus, which is located in the bone. This is a mid-sagittal section of the head, of the center of the head, And so here's anterior, here's posterior. You can see the brainstem, and that is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, anteriorly here is the nose. So that's why it is easy, probably, to access the pituitary gland through the nose. We call it trans-sphenoidal surgery. If there is a pituitary tumor, they pass through the nose and then crack the bone here, the body of the sphenoid bone, pass to the sphenoid sinus, and then crack the bone at the sella turcica, and then they can reach the tumor and remove the tumor. So returning back to the pituitary gland, it is in two lobes, and these two lobes, both of them are controlled by the hypothalamus. They secrete different types of hormones. They have different structure, and although they are both controlled by the hypothalamus, but the way that they are controlled by the hypothalamus is completely different. So we'll start with the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is the largest part here. It constitutes like 75% of the gland and is composed of epithelial cells. That's why the other name of the anterior pituitary is called the Adenohypophysis, while the posterior pituitary, they also call it the Neurohypophysis, and I will show you why they call it the Neurohypophysis in a moment. So this anterior hypophysis, or the anterior pituitary, or the Adenohypophysis, is controlled by the hypothalamus through what we call a portal circulation of blood. There are releasing hormones that are produced by some of the nuclei of the hypothalamus. We call them neurosecretory cells. They produce releasing hormones. These releasing hormones, because they are hormones, therefore they are going to access a capillary plexus. They go to the blood, access to a capillary plexus, and this capillary plexus will collect to form veins. You can see here, this is called the hypophyseal vein, but added to it is called portal vein. A portal vein, by definition, is a vein that is located between two capillary circulations. So here, as you can see, the capillary circulation has started as an artery, red, and then formed the vein, and then the vein is going to form within the anterior pituitary. Here, can you see? It forms another plexus. So we have a portal vein in between plexus 1 and plexus 2, capillary plexus. And it is through the second capillary plexus that the hormone will leave the blood, that releasing hormone, which comes from the hypothalamus, leaves the blood and affects the cells of the anterior pituitary. In general, as we will study that in the cardiovascular system, exchange of substances between the blood and the extracellular tissue takes place only in the capillaries, because the capillaries have very thin wall. They have only lined by endothelial cells and a basement membrane. Otherwise, you don't expect that there will be exchange of material in the artery here, for example, radial artery, or in the big artery, the aorta, or any other artery in the body. It should be a capillary circulation, and through this capillary circulation, exchange of material can take place. So here we have two capillary circulations, and in between them there is a portal vein, which is called the hypophyseal portal vein. A very good example of the portal vein we're going to study in the gastrointestinal tract is a portal that's called the hepatic portal vein. And this is located between the liver and the small intestine. So in the small intestine, there will be capillaries in the wall where the absorbed substances will reach the capillaries, carried by the portal vein to the liver, and then another capillary circulation in the liver will be present, so that these absorbed substances can be utilized by the liver, because the liver, as we will study later on, and probably we'll study that if you have a physiology course, it is the main factory in the body. So that's why there is the structures that the nutrients that are absorbed in the intestine will have an immediate access to the liver, because before they reach the general circulation. This is, I'm just mentioning that to show you another example of a portal circulation. okay, in the body. So it is by this way that the hormones secreted or the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus produce releasing and inhibiting hormones that diffuse to the first capillary network, go to the portal vein, and then capillaries of the anterior pituitary, where the hormones are secreted from the anterior pituitary. They will go to the general circulation. In the posterior pituitary, again, it is controlled by the hypothalamus, but it is a neurohypophysis. In other words, the neurons that are present here in the hypothalamus, collected in nuclei, so there are nuclei in the hypothalamus that secrete these hormones, but these hormones will not go to the blood. They are like neurotransmitters. So they pass through the axons of the cell, of the neuron, and descend down into the posterior pituitary. And they are stored there in the axon, in the axon terminal, in secretory vesicles. And when the time comes, when they are required, they will be released from the posterior pituitary. So in other words, if you have a section of the pituitary, of the posterior pituitary, it will be filled with axons of neurons. The cell bodies of those axons are located in the hypothalamus. And these axons, they have distended ends which are filled with the hormones. In other words, these hormones are not produced, they are not manufactured in the posterior pituitary. They are synthesized in the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary just releases these hormones, or it stores them and releases them, but does not synthesize them. The anterior pituitary synthesizes hormones under the control, again, of the hypothalamus, but by the way of a portal circulation. That's the difference between the two. Let's see here that we have anterior pituitary that secretes 7 major hormones. You can see the names of the hormones. You have to memorize them, and they are secreted by different types of cells. These cells, they cannot be easily differentiated from each other in conventional light microscopy. They need special stains to differentiate them. They almost look the same if you look at them at the conventional microscopy. So we have somatotrophs, for example, here, and they secrete the growth hormone, somatotropin. We have thyrotrophs, they secrete the thyroid-stimulating hormone. We have gonadotrophs that secrete actually 2 hormones which affect the gonads. The term gonads means either testis in the male or the ovary in the female. So they secrete follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The other types of cells are called lactotrophs, and these secrete prolactin, which causes the secretion of milk from the breast. And we have corticotrophs. They secrete adrenocorticotrophic hormone, ACTH. As the name indicates, adrenocortico, which affects the adrenal cortex. Okay? And not only ACTH, but also they secrete the corticotrophs, they secrete melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which stimulates melanocytes to produce more melanin. In the posterior pituitary, the hormones that are released, to be specific, they are released, they are not produced there, but they are released from there, are 2 hormones, the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. So these hormones, these 2 hormones in light blue here, they were produced in the hypothalamus and then passed down the axons, not the blood, to reach the axon terminal, which happens to be in the posterior pituitary, in the neurohypophysis. So here we have the hormones. We'll have some idea about them. Human growth hormone, somatotropin, is produced by the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary. And this hormone aims to increase the mitosis, also protein synthesis, so that it increases the length of bone, cartilage, size of muscle. It's a growth hormone. So it needs to do its effect on the liver. It acts on the liver and produce what we call glycogenolysis, destroys the glycogen. Remember the glycogen that are large molecules of glucose that are stored in the hepatocytes in the liver, so it breaks them down. Also, it affects the fatty tissue and cause what we call lipolysis, And so it has a growth promoting effects on almost every cell in the body. Promotes protein synthesis and cell division. And so mainly it affects the bone, cartilage, and muscle. For bone, if there is excessive secretion of growth hormone before puberty, then this will result in gigantism. And if there is deficiency in the secretion, then this results in dwarfism. Of course, this is not the only reason for dwarfism, but this is what we call pituitary dwarfism. If the excessive secretion, if the tumor that affects the somatotrophs affects a person after puberty, then at that time, remember that there is no way that the bone is going to increase in length because of the closure of the epiphyseal cartilage plates. So what happens is that the bones will increase in thickness, and this might mainly affect the bones of the hand and the mandible mainly, as you can see in this person. The condition is called acromegaly. The other hormone is the thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. We are going to study them next time. Generally, they increase the metabolic rate, a section of the thyroid gland. We are going to study it next time. The hypothalamus is going to produce thyrotropin hormone-releasing hormone. And this hormone reaches the thyrotrophs, one of the cell types that are present in the anterior pituitary, and will induce them to produce thyroid-stimulating hormone that affects the thyroid cells, follicular cells of the thyroid, to produce T3 and T4. The question here, how can the thyrotropin hormone-releasing hormone affect the thyrotrophs? Is it through blood or through axons? Blood, portal circulation, okay? Because this is the anterior pituitary. Then we have the gonadotrophs. I said that gonads are testis and the ovary, and we have two gonadotrophs. We have follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Doesn't mean that one of them belongs to the male, the other belongs to the female. No, both of them, they have effects on the testis. Both of them have effects on the ovary, but the effects differ, of course, from the male and the female. So for the follicular stimulating hormone, as the name indicates, it initiates the formation of the follicle, ovarian follicle. We will study that in block 3, that in the ovary, these oocytes are present in the ovary, dormant in the ovary. They are surrounded by cells, one layer of cells called follicular cells. When they are stimulated, a group of them will be stimulated during each menstrual cycle. And when they are stimulated, these cells, these follicular cells, are going to multiply and produce a secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and then the follicle will release the oocytes at the time of ovulation. One of these follicles only will release an oocyte at the time of ovulation. This stimulation of the follicular cells is produced by the follicular stimulating hormones, and it will stimulate these follicular cells, the cells that surround the oocyte, not the oocyte, the cells that surround the oocyte, that provide nourishment for the oocyte, that produce hormones that are going to affect the lining of the uterus in order to be ready to accept or the implantation, or what we call implantation of a fertilized ovum. We're going to study these details later on, but I'm just giving you an introduction to that. So it's not affecting the oocyte itself, what we call the gamete. The gametes are either the oocytes or the sperms. They are not affecting the oocyte, they are affecting the follicular cells surrounding the oocyte. In the male, it will stimulate the sperm production. So in the male, the story is different. The males, they continue to produce sperms. In the female is born with a predetermined amount of ova. That's it. Okay? But the males, they continue to produce sperms. And that's why here they are going to stimulate the production of sperms, what we call spermatogenesis. So this is a continuous process, and this is affected by the folliculars. It's the same hormone. They don't change. Well, that's good that they didn't change the name. So, but there are no follicles in the male, but still the hormone is called follicular stimulating hormone. There is the other hormone, the other gonadotrope is the luteinizing hormone. And in the female, it will stimulate the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, stimulate ovulation. You can see here, this is a mature follicle, a big follicle with multiple cells, and it will open, rupture, and release the ovum, which will go to the... This process is controlled by the luteinizing hormone, and then what remains of the follicle, these cells, we call them the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is going to control the uterus for the second half of the menstrual cycle, because ovulation takes place in the middle of the cycle, day 15 of the cycle. Again, I'm going to deal with these details later on. I'm just mentioning them so that you understand what is meant here by, like, what is the corpus luteum, what, ovulation, and then corpus luteum. So they cause ovulation, luteinizing hormone, and then it will control what remains of the follicle, because the ovulation takes place, the remainder of the follicle will form the corpus luteum. These cells are still active. They can still produce estrogen and progesterone to, again, to control the lining of the uterus. In the males, it is the same hormone, but it will stimulate not the production of the sperms, but it will stimulate other cells which are present in the testis. These are called interstitial cells of Leydig, and these produce testosterone. So it will stimulate the secretion of testosterone in the male from the testis. Both of them are gonadotropes because the testis and ovary are gonads. Then we have the prolactin, as the name indicates, lacto. Lacto means means milk. So the prolactin is produced by the lactotropes in the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates the breast to produce the milk. In the production of milk, we have two processes. We have production of milk and then the ejection of milk. So there are two hormones here involved. The prolactin is involved in the production of milk by the alveoli of the breast. And then there's another hormone, I'm going to mention it now, oxytocin, is responsible for the ejection of milk. And it is present again in both in male and female. We don't know exactly the function of it in the males, but tumors in the males of these lactotropes will result in a condition which is called galactorrhea, production of milk, which is not related to nursing, galactorrhea. The other hormone is the ACTH, Adrenocorticotrophic. As I mentioned, it affects the adrenal cortex. We are going to talk about the adrenal gland next time, and you will find that in the adrenal cortex there are three types of hormones, or three hormones. There are the what we call mineralocorticoids, and there are glucocorticoids, and then there are the androgens. So this one affects the glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol. So glucocorticoids are a group of hormones. The famous one is the cortisol. So it affects the secretion of cortisol, and cortisol causes increase in the amount of circulating blood sugar. How does it produce that? Either by acting on the liver to produce glycogenolysis, to destroy glycogen, or it will act on muscle cells to destroy the protein and convert that into sugar. This process is called glyconeogenesis. So production of glycogen from non-carbohydrate sources, either production of glucose from protein or fat. This is called gluconeogenesis. But glycogenolysis, it is destruction of glycogen, large molecules of glucose. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone, as the name indicates, stimulates melanocytes to produce the melanin pigment, and this will cause darkening of the skin in some areas of the body, especially during pregnancy. So there will be increase in the number, darkening of the freckles, for example, on the face. A pregnant woman usually has this line in the middle, dark line in the middle. They call it linea gravidarum. The nipple will become so dark and enlarged because of the melanocyte-stimulating hormone. The posterior pituitary produces two types of hormones. In fact, I would say it releases, not produces, because the production is there in the green area and in the yellow area, and then they are released from the posterior pituitary gland. These hormones are the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. Its other name is called vasopressin, and the second hormone is called the oxytocin. Let's start with the ADH, antidiuretic hormones. It's easy. Antidiuretic hormone. It reduces the amount of urine that is produced. How does this happen? We are going to study that again in block 3. In the kidney, there will be the urine is filtered from the blood, but there's excess amount of fluid that is filtered in the blood. That's why in the kidney we have a very long tube, which is called the nephron, and it is, as the fluid passes through the nephron, it's going to be reabsorbed here and there. Okay, so the antidiuretic hormone increases the amount of reabsorption from the nephron. Therefore, the amount of urine that's going to be excreted eventually will be very small. Antidiuretic hormone. Not only that, but also it increases any loss of fluid from the body. So it decreases sweating. And also it increases the blood pressure by causing contraction of smooth muscle in the wall of the arterioles. And that's why the other name of this hormone is vasopressin. Okay? It affects blood vessels, pressin, pressure. If this hormone is deficient, we will get a condition which is called, any idea? What do you think that happens to the patient if this hormone is deficient? Become dehydrated, lose urine a lot. There's a lot of urination. Okay, it is diabetes, but not the diabetes mellitus, which is because of insulin. It's called diabetes insipidus, and there is no sugar in the urine. The last hormone here, which is, again, I would say it is released from the posterior pituitary gland, not produced by the posterior pituitary, is called the oxytocin, and this stimulates smooth muscles. Smooth muscles in two locations. Smooth muscles on the uterus, and this will be very helpful and during delivery. Okay, so it causes contractions of the uterus to push the baby through the birth canal, and also it affects not smooth muscles, but there are small epithelial cells very close to the alveoli of the breast called myoepithelial cells. They are something between epithelial cells and muscles. They are epithelial cells that contain contractile elements, actin and myosin. So they can contract a little bit, and so when they contract and they are located around the alveoli, which produce the milk, therefore they are going to cause ejection of the milk. So this is the second hormone that affects lactation. One of them is the prolactin, which causes secretion of milk, and the other one is the oxytocin, which causes ejection of the milk by the fact that this hormone acts on either smooth muscle cells or muscles that look like them, the myoepithelial cells, which are present in the breast. The synthetic form of this hormone is called pitocin. The pitocin, and the pitocin is, well, if you go to any delivery room, you will find that they are using pitocin. They use it for induction of delivery because it causes contraction of smooth muscles which are present in the wall of the uterus. It's the synthetic form of oxytocin. Okay.